This happened 72 hours ago, and the world almost didn't see it. On January 8th and 9th, what occurred in Iran was possibly the largest massacre since 1988. According to sources including statements from Iranian authorities themselves, up to 2,000 people were killed in just 2 nights. That's more deaths in 48 hours than the entire 2022 MASSACRE protests, which killed 551 people over several months. But here's what makes this different. Here's what makes this terrifying. The Iranian government didn't just shoot protesters, they cut off the entire country from the world. No internet, no phone calls, no way to document what was happening. For 108 hours, that's 4.5 days, Iran went dark. And when the blackout finally lifted, even partially, the stories that emerged were horrific. Bodies in bags at morgues, hospitals overwhelmed, mass graves suspected, families searching for loved ones who simply vanished. This is the story of what happened during those 48 hours. This is the investigation the Iranian government tried to hide, and this is why the entire world is watching what happens next. Before we dive into the massacre itself, we need to understand how we got here. These protests didn't start on January 8th. They began on December 28th, 2025, and the trigger was economic collapse. Iran's currency, the rial, had been in free fall for months. By late December, it hit a devastating milestone: 1 million rials per US dollar. Think about that for a second. 1 million of your national currency to buy a single US dollar. If you were an Iranian citizen with savings, you just watched your life's work evaporate. If you had a salary, it was suddenly worth half what it was a year ago. Inflation was crushing ordinary Iranians. The price of bread doubled, medicine became unaffordable, electricity was being cut for hours at a time, water shortages were affecting major cities. This wasn't just economic hardship, this was economic catastrophe, and the Iranian people had had enough. On December 28th, protests erupted in multiple cities simultaneously: Tehran, Isfahan, Mashhad, Tabriz, Kermanshah. But unlike previous protests that focused on specific issues, these demonstrations had a different character from the start. Yes, people were chanting about economic conditions. Yes, they were demanding better living standards. But very quickly, the chants evolved into something more fundamental: death to the dictator. That's what thousands of Iranians were chanting, referring to Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. Long live the Shah. Some protesters were openly calling for the restoration of the monarchy, waving the lion and sun flag that predated the 1979 Islamic Revolution. Neither Gaza nor Lebanon, my life for Iran. This was a direct rejection of Iran's foreign policy, which has spent billions supporting proxy groups across the Middle East, while its own citizens suffered. The government's initial response was relatively measured, at least by Iranian standards. Police used tear gas. They made arrests. There were reports of beatings. But in those first few days, the death toll remained relatively low. According to human rights activists' news agency, known as Harana, by January 6th, about 34 protesters had been killed since the protests began. That's 34 deaths in 9 days. Tragic, but not unprecedented for Iran. The 2019 protests killed an estimated 300 to 1,500 people. The 2022 Mahsa Amini protests killed 551. So in early January 2026, while the protests were growing, they seemed to be following a familiar, if brutal, pattern. The government would crack down. Some people would die. Eventually, the protests would fizzle out as they had before, but then something changed. Something that would turn these protests into what may be the deadliest crackdown in Iran's modern history. On January 9th, a significant moment occurred that galvanized the protesters. Reza Pahlavi, the son of Iran's last Shah, who has lived in exile since 1979, made a direct call to action. He urged Iranians to take control of city centers. He told them to hoist the pre-revolutionary lion and sun flag. And he made a promise. He said he would return to Iran soon. For context, Reza Pahlavi has been a symbolic figure for Iranian monarchists for decades, but he's never had significant political power or influence inside Iran. The Islamic Republic has ruled for 47 years. Most Iranians alive today have never lived under a monarchy, but in that moment, with the economy collapsing and frustration boiling over, his call resonated. On the night of January 9th into January 10th, massive crowds gathered across Iran. They were chanting his name. They were waving monarchist flags. They were openly calling for regime change. And this is when the Iranian government made its decision. According to multiple reports that would emerge later, Supreme Leader Khamenei himself gave the order. The period of tolerance was over. It was time to put the rioters in their place. And the method chosen was overwhelming, lethal force. Here's what we know happened on January 8th, based on the information available. At approximately 7 p.m. local time, Iran's internet began to shut down. NetBlocks, an organization that monitors internet connectivity worldwide, watched in real time as Iran's connection to the global internet dropped from 100% to less than 1%. This wasn't a technical failure. This was a coordinated shutdown. Mobile data stopped working. Landline internet went dead. Even phone calls, both domestic and international, became impossible in most areas. Iran had effectively isolated itself from the world. Why? Because what was about to happen, the government didn't want documented. According to eyewitness reports that would later emerge, security forces began moving into position across major cities that evening, not regular police. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, known as the IRGC, the Basij, the paramilitary volunteer militia. These are the forces the regime uses when it needs brutality, not restraint. Multiple sources, including Iran International, a Persian-language media outlet based in London, reported that the Supreme National Security Council had issued explicit orders. Security forces were authorized to use live ammunition, not rubber bullets, not warning shots, live fire into crowds. What happened next, according to reports from inside Iran, was systematic. In Tehran alone, 6 hospitals reportedly recorded 217 deaths on the night of January 8th. Most were from gunshot wounds. In Karizak, south of Tehran, eyewitnesses who went searching for missing family members described seeing rows of bodies in bags. Some reports claimed they counted over 400 bodies at that single location. In Kermanshah, protesters and security forces clashed with such intensity that both sides suffered heavy casualties. The IRGC's Nabi Akram Corps in that province reported 10 of their members killed. If 10 security forces died in just one province, how many protesters died there? In Shiraz, hospitals were reported to be in crisis mode. They didn't have enough surgeons to treat all the wounded. Medical staff were making impossible decisions about who to save and who to let die. In Fardis, near Karaj, videos emerged showing bodies on the ground. The footage was grainy, obviously recorded quickly and in fear, but it showed what appeared to be multiple casualties in a single location. This pattern repeated across the country: Tehran, Isfahan, Mashhad, Tabriz, Kermanshah, Shiraz, Lordagan, Kudasht. In city after city, on the nights of January 8th and 9th, security forces opened fire on protesters. And because the internet was down, because phone lines were cut, because Iran had isolated itself from the world, there was no real-time documentation, no live streams, no viral videos, no international outcry as it was happening, just darkness and gunfire. Now let's talk about the numbers, because this is where things get complicated and we need to be very careful about what we can verify versus what remains alleged. An Iranian government official made a statement to international news agencies that approximately 2,000 people had been killed since the protests began on December 28th. Note the specific language, since the protests began, not specifically on January 8th and 9th, and including both civilians and members of security forces. The official blamed what he called terrorists for the violence. This is important because it's the closest thing we have to an official acknowledgement of the scale of deaths. The Iranian government, which typically downplays casualties, admitted to roughly 2,000 deaths. That alone is significant. But it doesn't tell us when those deaths occurred or the breakdown between protesters and security forces. Now, separate from that official statement, Iran International published an editorial conclusion based on what they described as a review of sources and medical data. Their conclusion? At least 12,000 people were killed in what they called the largest killing in Iran's contemporary history, carried out largely over 2 consecutive nights, January 8th and 9th. Let me be very clear about this. This 12,000 number has not been independently verified by major international news organizations like Reuters, Associated Press, BBC, or the United Nations. Iran International is a credible Persian-language media outlet, but they are also explicitly opposed to the Iranian government and receive funding from sources critical of the regime. That doesn't mean they're wrong. But it does mean we need to note that their higher estimates haven't been confirmed by independent, neutral sources. So what do independent human rights organizations say? HRANA, the human rights activists' news agency, which has been documenting deaths throughout the protests, reported as of January 11th that they had verified 599 deaths. That's 510 protesters and 89 security force members. CNN, citing HRANA and other activists, reported more than 500 deaths. NBC News put the number at 572 as of their latest reporting. Amnesty International, which tends to be very conservative in its verification process, confirmed at least 28 deaths in the first few days of January based on credible evidence they could verify. By January 10th, after the worst of the violence, they were still working to verify the full scale of casualties. The key phrase there is verify. Organizations like Amnesty International and HRANA won't report a death unless they have multiple sources confirming it. names, locations, circumstances. In normal circumstances, this careful methodology gives us the most reliable numbers. But these weren't normal circumstances. Iran had cut itself off from the world. Verification became nearly impossible. This is the critical challenge in understanding what happened. We have a range of estimates. On the conservative end, around 600 deaths verified by human rights groups. These are deaths they can document with names, dates, and evidence. In the middle, we have the Iranian government's own statement of approximately 2,000 deaths since December 28th. This is significant because governments typically undercount protest deaths, not overcount them. And on the high end, we have Iran International's estimate of up to 12,000 deaths concentrated in just 48 hours. The truth is probably somewhere in this range. It's almost certainly higher than 600, given the internet blackout made verification impossible. It may well be close to the 2,000 figure the government itself admitted to. Whether it reaches the 12,000 estimate, we simply cannot confirm without independent access to hospitals, morgues, and death records in Iran. What we can say with certainty is this. Something extraordinary and extraordinarily violent happened on January 8th and 9th. The internet blackout wasn't a coincidence. It was a tool. Cut off the country, use overwhelming force, then control the narrative afterward. Let me walk you through how the blackout worked and why it was so effective. NetBlocks began documenting the shutdown in real time. At 7 p.m. on January 8th, connectivity dropped. Within hours, Iran was at less than 1% of normal internet traffic. But it wasn't just internet. Mobile phone networks stopped working. You couldn't make calls. You couldn't send text messages. Even landline phones in many areas went dead. This level of communication shutdown is rare. We've seen partial internet blackouts before. Myanmar did it during their coup. Ethiopia has done it during conflicts. But a complete blackout of both internet and phone systems across a country of 88 million people? That's extraordinary. And it's deliberate. The Iranian government has sophisticated deep packet inspection technology provided, ironically, by Western companies before sanctions. They can control their digital borders in ways most governments can't. So on January 8th, they flipped a switch and Iran went dark. For 108 hours, from Thursday night through Monday morning, the country was largely isolated from the world. During those 108 hours, we have fragmented reports. Some people managed to get information out through satellite internet like Starlink. Some used VPNs that still functioned. Some got messages out through contacts in neighboring countries. What they described was terrifying. One eyewitness who reached Iran International described the scene at Al Ghadir Hospital in eastern Tehran, bodies arriving in pickup trucks, medical staff overwhelmed, no way to contact families. Another described the forensic center in Karizak. They said they saw what appeared to be hundreds of bodies. They specifically mentioned seeing a label on a video that said photo number something out of 250, as if someone was documenting the scale but couldn't get the full evidence out. A family in Kermanshah described searching for their 23-year-old son who went to a protest. They called hospitals. They called police stations. No information. When they finally got through to someone 3 days later, they were told to check the morgue. They found him there, shot 3 times. These are the stories that emerged once communications partially resumed, and there are hundreds of them, thousands of families across Iran searching for loved ones. Many still don't know. When internet finally started coming back on January 12th, it didn't come back fully. The government restored some landline internet, they allowed some international calls, but mobile data remained blocked. Social media was still censored. They gave enough access to ease the pressure, but not enough to allow full documentation of what happened. This is sophisticated information control. And it worked. 4 days after the worst violence, we still don't have a complete picture. We probably never will. Bodies were reportedly taken directly to morgues, bypassing hospitals. Some families have reported being told their loved ones were buried quickly, with no opportunity to see the body. There are unconfirmed reports of mass graves. None of this can be verified because independent journalists can't operate freely in Iran, and international investigators aren't allowed in. Now let's talk about the evidence we do have. Iran International published videos that they said came from inside Iran during the blackout. These videos showed what appeared to be bodies in bags at medical facilities. They showed protesters being shot at. They showed the aftermath of violence. But here's the challenge. None of these videos have been independently verified by major international fact-checking organizations. In the fog of war, in the chaos of a blackout, videos can be mislabeled. Old footage can be presented as new. Footage from one location can be said to be from another. This isn't to say the videos are fake. Many of them almost certainly are genuine documentation of what happened. But without independent verification, we have to be cautious about treating them as definitive proof. What we can verify is this: the blackout happened, confirmed by NetBlocks and multiple international tech organizations. The protests happened, confirmed by hundreds of sources, and the Iranian government itself. Violence happened, confirmed by the government's own admission of approximately 2,000 deaths. Hospitals were overwhelmed, confirmed by medical staff who got information out. Security forces used live ammunition, confirmed by the Iranian Foreign Ministry spokesman who admitted forces had shot protesters. What remains disputed is the exact scale. 600 verified deaths? Almost certainly an undercount given the blackout. 2,000 deaths, as the government claimed, quite possibly accurate or close to it. 12,000 deaths, as Iran International concluded, possible but not verified by independent sources. The honest answer is, we don't know the full truth yet, and we may never know. The Iranian government controls access to hospitals, morgues, and death records. They've already started their own narrative. The deaths were caused by terrorists and foreign agents, not government forces. They're holding trials, and at least one protester, 26-year-old Irfan Soltani, has already been sentenced to execution. The trials reportedly lasted minutes. No lawyers, no appeals. This is how the government plans to handle the aftermath: execute some protesters as examples, bury the evidence, control the narrative. The international response has been swift and significant. President Donald Trump, who took office just weeks ago, has made Iran a priority. On January 12th, he announced something extraordinary. Any country doing business with Iran will face a 25% tariff on all trade with the United States, effective immediately. Think about what this means. China is Iran's largest trading partner. In 2025, China exported $6.2 billion worth of goods to Iran. Now, those Chinese goods coming to America could face an additional 25% tariff on top of existing tariffs. That could mean Chinese goods facing 45% total tariffs. India, another major Iran trading partner, could face 75% total tariffs on goods coming to America. Turkey, Brazil, Russia. All of Iran's major trading partners now have to choose. Trade with Iran or trade with America. They can't easily do both. This is economic warfare on a scale we haven't seen before. And Trump has made it clear this is just the beginning. He's openly discussed military options. In an interview with NBC News, he said it could happen, referring to possible U.S. strikes on Iran. He said he's being briefed every hour or less on the situation. He's presented with military plans. This isn't hypothetical. This is active planning. The European response has been more measured, but still significant. The Netherlands, Spain, Finland, and other countries have summoned Iranian ambassadors to protest the crackdown. The United Nations has issued statements about the cycle of horrific violence. Multiple countries have announced they're reviewing their diplomatic relationships with Iran, but Europe doesn't have the leverage America does. The real pressure is economic, and Trump's tariff threat, if fully implemented, could devastate Iran's already collapsing economy. The Iranian rial, which was already at historic lows, has fallen further. Iranians who still have savings are desperately trying to convert them to dollars or gold. Businesses are closing. Unemployment was already high. Now it's getting worse. This creates a vicious cycle. The economic crisis caused the protests. The protests caused the crackdown. The crackdown caused international sanctions. The sanctions will worsen the economic crisis, potentially triggering more protests. Inside Iran, the government has responded with a mix of extreme force and attempts at diplomatic outreach. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi gave a press conference where he said Iran is ready for war, but also ready for dialogue. This is the standard Iranian playbook. Act tough, but leave room for negotiation. But this time it might not work. Trump isn't Obama. He's not interested in another nuclear deal. He's not interested in gradual pressure. He wants regime change, or at least a fundamental shift in Iranian behavior, and he has tools Obama didn't have. The Abraham Accords have normalized relations between Israel and several Arab states, isolating Iran regionally. Oil prices have been relatively stable, meaning Iran can't rely on oil revenue to weather sanctions. The global economy, while facing some challenges, isn't in crisis, so countries have more flexibility to comply with U.S. sanctions. And perhaps most importantly, Trump has shown a willingness to use military force. The January 2nd operation in Venezuela, where U.S. forces abducted President Maduro, sent a clear message. Trump is willing to take actions that previous presidents wouldn't. So where does this go from here? There are several possible scenarios, and none of them are good for the Iranian regime. Scenario 1, the government succeeds in crushing the protests through sheer brutality. Thousands are arrested, executions are carried out, Fear takes hold. The protests fizzle out. The government survives. This is what happened in 2019. It's what happened in 2009. It's what the regime is betting on now. But there's a problem. Each crackdown radicalizes more people. Each execution creates martyrs. Each family searching for a disappeared loved one becomes an enemy of the state. You can rule through fear for a while, maybe even a long while, but eventually that fear turns to rage. And rage is harder to control than fear. Scenario 2. The protests continue and escalate despite the crackdown. The economy continues to collapse. More people join the demonstrations. Security forces start to fracture. Some soldiers and police refuse orders to shoot their fellow citizens. The government loses control. This is what happened in Syria in 2011. It led to a civil war that killed hundreds of thousands. Iran is much larger than Syria. It has more weapons. It has more factions. An Iranian civil war would be catastrophic not just for Iran, but for the entire Middle East. Scenario 3. International pressure becomes unbearable. The economy completely collapses. The government can't pay its security forces. Even the IRGC starts to question whether it's worth defending the current system. Elements within the regime begin looking for an exit. Maybe a managed transition. Maybe a military coup that replaces the supreme leader with someone more pragmatic. This is unlikely, but not impossible. The IRGC is a powerful institution. If they decide the Islamic Republic is becoming a liability rather than an asset, they could move against Khamenei. Scenario 4. External intervention. Trump makes good on his threats and launches strikes against Iranian nuclear facilities, IRGC bases, or other targets. This could rally Iranians around the flag, at least temporarily, or it could accelerate the regime's collapse by showing how vulnerable they are. It would almost certainly lead to regional conflict. Iran has proxies across the Middle East. Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, militias in Iraq, they would all likely retaliate against U.S. and Israeli targets. The risk of escalation to a full regional war is real. Most likely we'll see some combination of these scenarios. The protests will continue at a lower level, the crackdown will continue, the economy will worsen, international pressure will increase, and at some point something will break. Maybe it's the currency completely collapsing. Maybe it's a major defection from the government. Maybe it's a particularly brutal incident that finally pushes the international community to take more serious action. What we witnessed on January 8th and 9th isn't the end of this story. It's a chapter, maybe a turning point. But the story of these protests is still being written, and the death toll is still rising. As I'm recording this, new reports are coming in, the internet is partially restored, and more stories are emerging, more families finding their loved ones in morgues, more videos appearing, more evidence of what happened during those 108 hours of darkness. Let me be very clear about what we know and what we don't know. We know the Iranian government imposed a total communications blackout for over 4 days. This is verified by net blocks and multiple independent sources. We know an Iranian government official stated approximately 2,000 people had been killed since the protests began. This is the government's own admission. We know human rights organizations have verified at least 600 deaths with names and evidence. This is a conservative count limited by the blackout. We know hospitals across Iran were overwhelmed with casualties on January 8th and 9th. We know security forces used live ammunition on protesters. The government itself has admitted this. What we don't know with certainty is the exact death toll from those specific 48 hours. Estimates range from hundreds to thousands. Iran International's estimate of 12,000 deaths has not been independently verified. But given the scale of the blackout, the government's own admission of 2,000 total deaths, and the overwhelming evidence of mass casualties, the true number is almost certainly in the thousands. We may never know the exact figure. Many bodies were reportedly taken directly to morgues. Some may have been buried quickly. Records may be destroyed or hidden. This is how authoritarians operate. Kill in the dark. Control the narrative afterward. The title of this video says 2,000 killed. That's based on the Iranian government's own statement. It's the most concrete official number we have. But it may be an undercount, and it almost certainly includes deaths from the entire protest period, not just January 8th and 9th. The claim of 12,000 deaths in 48 hours remains unverified by independent international sources, though Iran International stands by their conclusion. The truth, as is often the case in situations like this, probably lies somewhere between the official admission and the highest estimates. What is not in dispute is that something horrific happened. A government turned its most brutal forces against its own people. It cut them off from the world to hide what it was doing. And when the world finally got a glimpse of what happened, the evidence suggested one of the deadliest crackdowns in modern Iranian history. This is important for several reasons. First, it shows the lengths to which the Iranian government will go to maintain power. They're willing to kill thousands of their own citizens. They're willing to completely shut down communications across a country of 88 million people. They're willing to face international condemnation and economic devastation. Second, it shows that information control is now a weapon of war. The blackout wasn't just about preventing organization and coordination among protesters. It was about preventing documentation. If nobody can film it, if nobody can report it, if nobody can verify it, did it really happen? The Iranian government is betting that uncertainty and disputed numbers will be enough to avoid serious consequences. Third, it shows that protests in authoritarian states are incredibly dangerous. The Iranian people knew the risks when they went to the streets. They knew the government had killed protesters before. They went anyway because the economic situation was so desperate and the anger so deep that fear wasn't enough to keep them home. That's a remarkable act of courage, or desperation, or both. And fourth, it shows that the international community still struggles to respond effectively to these situations. Trump's tariffs are significant, the diplomatic pressure is real, but will it actually change the Iranian government's behavior? History suggests probably not. Authoritarian regimes can endure enormous external pressure if they maintain control internally. The question is whether they can maintain that internal control. And right now, we don't know the answer. What we do know is that thousands of Iranian families are grieving.